So after Louis C.K. was accused of sexual misconduct, the comedian did something unexpected. He admitted it, and he apologized. Some thought his career was over. Instead, he went on one of the biggest comedy tours. Today on the podcast, what does the Louis C.K. story tell you about cancel culture? I'm Elamin Abdelmahmoud. This is Commotion. Listen, by now we're somewhat familiar with the playbook, right? When high-profile men are accused of sexual misconduct, the same thing tends to happen. First, they deny the allegations, they lash out against their accusers. Sometimes they check themselves into some kind of treatment. What they generally don't do is admit it. Admit everything and say, these stories are correct, and then move on. But when Louis C.K. was accused of sexual misconduct by 5 women back in 2017, he admitted it, and then he apologized. That's exactly what he did.
Popular comedian Louis C.K. at the center of the latest sexual misconduct allegations, now confirming them in a statement saying these stories are true. The bombshell report by The Times detailed stories from the women stretching back more than a decade, all saying Louis exposed and touched himself in front of them.
For Louis C.K., moving on meant that turning what he did into his act, and then also selling out arenas in doing so. He called that tour Sorry. Cara Moniz and Caroline Sue made a new film, and it takes us through the rumors that have been swirling around the comedian for years and introduces us to some of the women who came forward. But most of all, I think it asks us to think critically through the dynamics of cancel culture. It is called Sorry Not Sorry, and it opens at the Toronto International Film Festival this week. Cara, Caroline are with me in studio. Hey, everybody. How's it going?
Good, thank you.
Morning.
Thank you for having us.
Of course. Caroline, let me start with you.
Okay.
Why did you want to make this film about Louis C.K.?
Yeah, well, I was a big Louis C.K. fan. I watched his series, and I loved his stand-up, and I just thought he was brilliant and insightful. And then when the article came out, I was surprised because I'm not I wasn't hugely tracking comedy and the rumors. And then my initial reaction was like a little bit, is it that bad that he should disappear, to be totally honest. But I knew that was not necessarily the right way of looking at it. And so I kind of started to reach out to people, the women in the story, Noam Dorman. And then when he came back at the Comedy Cellar and Noam did a podcast asking a lot of essential
Noam
questions.
runs the Comedy Cellar.
He does, sorry. Yeah. He's the owner of the Comedy Cellar. And he asked questions like, what are we supposed to do with these people who are the arbiters of when someone can come back, and shouldn't we allow people to come back? So that really got me thinking, and I became kind of obsessed with trying to get my head around the issues, and I just really wanted a helpful way of navigating through the story. As a fan, what am I supposed to do with this? How do I think about it? And that's kind of when the film started.
The first question you pose to yourself is so big. Is it so bad that he should disappear? I want to come back to that because I think it's a good guiding question that I think a lot of people are also thinking about. Cara, of all the high-profile men accused of sexual misconduct, Louis C.K. seems to stand apart. What do you think makes him different?
Yeah, I think because he admitted it. I think that's one huge part of this, that felt very unusual at that time, where there was a pattern, and still is a pattern, of denying. So I think that enabled us to explore a lot of other questions because we weren't deliberating whether or not he had done this. And I also think that because this story lived in the gray area for so many people, it made it feel like there was a lot to dig into, because like Caroline said, there are a lot of people who were thinking, is it so bad, and what do we do now with this person who I love so much?
Yeah. Well, I'm really interested in the dynamic of watching the documentary. There's a part that almost as you're watching it, almost feels like you're watching a thriller, because you start off with this narrative that we've sort of talked about, and then the case that you built in the documentary is that actually people have known about this for a really long time, and they've just been like, this is not my problem. And you literally hear someone like Mike Schur, the creator of The Good Place and also one of the co-creators of Parks and Recreation, say, yeah, we had him back on the show, even though I sort of knew about this, but I kind of felt like it wasn't my problem. And then what I think your movie does so successfully is show how pervasive that thinking is. All the people who've kind of like heard something here, heard something there, and then just didn't do anything about it. And like, to me, the crescendo of that section is Jon Stewart, and he's being faced with this question in front of like a live audience, and everyone is like saying, "We all heard. How can someone like Jon Stewart not have heard?" What do you make of the idea that people sort of like turned a blind eye to this, even though they heard from a friend of a friend, and they were like, "Oh, maybe I shouldn't get too deeply into this"?
I mean, I think that issue is something that really is relatable to everyone.
Yeah.
Especially ourselves. I mean, in making the film, it makes you really think about what have you done in situations like that?
Yeah.
What should you have done? Would you really have acted differently if you heard a rumor about someone who you are friends with and that's unverified? So I think that in a way that's the heart of the film, is like turning the question onto the audience to get people thinking about maybe ways in which we can all do better or act differently, and even if you would act in the same way, I think just the process of thinking it through is important. So
Yeah, I mean, there's, these rumors are floating around for such a long time. We get evidence from a bunch of people that basically became like this like known floating around kind of joke thing. But then suddenly the New York Times publishes a piece, and then there's a turn. What made that surprising in terms of how the New York Times publishing the story sort of pushed it to the next level?
I think because there were finally names attached to the story, I think that makes it a lot harder to ignore.
Yeah.
I think, and that's something I think that Alison Herman talks about, that if you hear these rumors and you don't quite have names, it's easier to kind of just push it away and think, well, I don't even know if it's true, even if you have heard it lots and lots of times. So I think when the New York Times published their article and had so many names, it kind of forced the conversation. And of course, it was a very unique time with the story about Harvey Weinstein just coming out. There was a lot of momentum in that moment.
Carolyn, when that moment happened, did something shift for you? Did something shift for you in terms of how you treated the story?
Not yet. I mean, honestly, not yet. I mean, it didn't, obviously, I was surprised. I didn't know these things, so obviously that changed. But my thinking really evolved over time, exploring the story. And I found that really I had to really question my own very basic beliefs about things. I think it's easy just to fixate on Louis and what happened to him, and is he coming back or is he not, and then really not think about some other questions, like what happened to the women, like how do you really think about their careers in the midst of this, and how do you, it's hard to focus on something that never was allowed to happen.
Yeah, and in many ways, the movie is the story of how a bunch of lives were, I'm not going to say destroyed, but like certainly like they were altered forever by just saying, hey, this actually happened to me. And then the person who they said that about said, that is true. I did do those things. And then we kind of end up in this position where, they're still hounded by the state. Like one of the people that you have in the film, Jen Kirkman, who's sort of one of the earliest people to mention that Louis C.K. Had done these things. She said, like, is this going to be, like the first thing that people sort of know me for? Abby also mentions that in this. What do you make of like where these women are now and their relationship to how the story has evolved, do you think?
I mean, I think it's a real dilemma coming forward and realizing that this is something that's going to be attached to your name forever. And like you said, we hear a lot about this in the film that, Jen talks about, like, I thought I could be a lot of things, that I could talk about this thing that happened to me and also be all these other things. And so I think that it's complicated. I think that the women who participated in the film see value in continuing to speak about this because there is something that hasn't changed.
So 9 months after all of these stories came out, Louis C.K. was back on stage, and soon after that, he was selling out massive venues. He calls that comeback show Sorry. And this is not an easy listen, I should warn listeners, but I think it's also really important context. So if you don't want to hear this, I get it. Totally step away, turn us down for a minute and come back for a minute. But let's just listen to this for a moment.
I like jerking off. I don't like being alone. That's all I can tell you. I get lonely. Where is everyone? It's just sad. I like company. I like to share. I'm good at it, too. If you're good at juggling, you wouldn't do it alone in the dark. You would gather folks and amaze them.
The thing that sticks out in that clip for me, Kara, is not just the lack of remorse. It's the laughter. It's the applause, right? It's the idea that the crowd is, in fact, going wild at this bit, I guess. How did the women that you spoke to, how did they feel when this came out?
I don't want to speak for the women in the film. I think, Jen, she does say in the film that he reframed it as a kink, and I think that that's what is really striking to us when we saw that footage of him on stage, that this thing that he had, expressed remorse about in his public statement to the New York Times, now he is presenting it as a joke. And I think, like Michael Ian Black talks about, there was a lot of expectation that he was going to come back and speak about this in a way that kind of moved the needle and helped fans understand why it was harmful. But, instead he's talking about it like this, his quote-unquote thing.
When that special came out, did you watch the special when it came out?
I was actually there with some of the producers of the film.
Oh, wow.
In the audience.
Yeah.
And we were so shocked when he came out on stage in front of a giant sorry sign to a Bob Dylan song.
Yeah.
And it seemed so bold and as someone says in the film, he was giving a middle finger to everyone.
Yeah.
Who, as Michael Ian Black says.
Yeah.
So
did it strike you as at odds with the statement?
Yeah, I mean, and that's part of the process of thinking about him as an artist, and I mean, just it made my my thinking of him evolve from okay, he really doesn't give a shit. Am I allowed to swear?
You just did.
Sorry,
and it's fine.
I'm so sorry.
Okay.
But it kind of showed a point of view of thinking about it, which was not remorseful at all.
Yeah.
And people ate it up. People loved it. So.
One of the things that really struck with me is Wesley Morris of the New York Times. One of the things that he said was, in an apology, a good apology is naming the things that you did, the mistakes that you made. And yes, that is the first step. But then you got to go further and make amends. Did we ever see Louis sort of move towards any of those things? Because I think the very next thing after that apology is the special, is these jokes. And then after that, you kind of see him sort of push further and further into, I guess, more of a defensive position. And it's been 6 years since then. Yeah, I mean, I'm not aware. I don't know if he has made amends in any sort of way personally. Yeah. But at least from a public perspective, we see him going in another direction. Yeah. And I think that there was something that a lot of fans needed to see, that he was, talking about why this behavior was a problem, and that's just not what came. I think that's probably the most surprising thing to me, Caroline, is that as far as I can tell from everything that Louis C.K. has done in his comedy career, he's someone who appears to be aware of the consequences of the things that he has to say. He's someone who I think appears to be aware of what he has to do in order to regain people's favor. He just seems like he's not that interested in it. Or at least that's the appearance when we sort of look at that comedy special, the positioning of this as a kink, and then the willingness to make jokes about it, and then nothing further in public. It seems like he's kind of chosen to say, I'm not going to engage with that anymore. I'm just going to move on. And it seems, at least from as far as we can tell, the comedy world is yeah, that's fine. Louis C.K. still sells out arenas when he does tour. Louis C.K. still appears regularly at the biggest comedy clubs. Anyone from Dave Chappelle to Bill Maher will defend him regularly. There was this whole machinery of sort of defending Louis C.K. that kicked in immediately in the aftermath of that. Is there a part of you that makes you go, I guess that's just what comedy has to be like? This is what this universe is? He's just they're one of their own and they'll always defend him? Is that the reaction that you have?
No, I don't think it has to be that way. I mean, I think he could address it tomorrow in a stand-up set and people would appreciate it. Yeah. So I don't think that door is ever closed, and who knows, maybe in 20 years he'll do that. But I think, while he has been able to go on, and leave it behind.
Yeah.
Certainly economically, probably he's been able to. The women in the film, Jen, excluding Jen, have their comedy careers have suffered a lot.
He goes on to win, by the way, the Grammy Award for Best Comedy Album after that, a couple years in a row, I think. What do you think that teaches us about the phrase cancel culture that we keep bandying about all the time?
Yeah, I mean, what is it truly to be canceled? He lost his shows, that's true. But, I think that phrase, as Mike Schur says, is kind of rings hollow. Like, people have flourishing careers who are supposedly canceled. And actually, Ida Rodriguez, who's in the film, we unfortunately couldn't fit this in, but she said something to us like, I've been trying to be canceled for years because that's how you make all the money. And I think there's some truth to that. You do get an audience.
Yeah. One of the most striking parts of the movie was Ida Rodriguez saying, somebody asked her, hey, what do you make of Louis C.K.? Do you think he's going to be back? And she's like, yeah. Just kind of very quickly, like clearly and obviously, yes, nothing ever happens to people, who are accused of this stuff, who admit this stuff. And there's a truthfulness to that that's like just knowing that so comfortably is just like a fact of life. That was like really striking to me. Kara, how would you say working on this kind of maybe shifted your understanding of what really matters when we were all talking about cancel culture?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel like for me, I realized how much time we spend talking about the accused and, what should happen to Louis. Should he come back? Should he not come back? And not a lot of time thinking about the environment that enabled him. I think that it's easy to try and put it all on one person. But of course, this was something that was happening over many years. And there are a lot of people who hadn't spoken up. And I think it also taught me a lot about how little attention I had personally given to the people who had come forward. And I hadn't considered the repercussions of speaking out. So I think that it's just raised a lot of questions for me for how I kind of process these stories and also in my personal life, how I deal with this kind of behavior when I see it and, will I speak up in the future?
Maybe that's the most challenging part of the movie is that it sort of puts you as a viewer in the hot spot, put yourself in these positions. How would you act? How would you, sort of shift your position on this? I'm not going to say what message because I don't think there is one. But I'm going to say what questions. What questions are you hoping people ask themselves after watching this movie, Carolyn?
Yeah, I think one of the key questions is Cara Buckley's question, New York Times reporter, who says, why are women, punished for just saying what happened to them? Mm-hmm. And like, why don't we ever think about that? Like, that's a really, and that, even having, thinking about the story for years and years, it still is something I have to remind myself because it's very reflexive just to think about the famous person who, and, why is our mind stuck on that? Like, why didn't they leave the room? Why didn't they hang up the phone? When really those aren't the questions to be asking.
Yeah.
So I think kind of a reconsideration of like who we think is important to think about is really at the heart of the film.
I think that's a good place to leave it. Thank you so much for being here. Your film was incredible. Congratulations on the premiere. I hope you guys have a great time. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much.
Of course, Carolyn Sue and Kara Moniz. Film is called Sorry Not Sorry. It's having its world premiere at the Toronto International Film Festival this week. My name is Elamin Abdelmahmoud, and you are listening to Commotion. Listen, the next person I'm about to speak to was actually in that documentary about Louis C.K., Alison Herman. Welcome to Commotion.
Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. I'm so happy that you're here. We are not here to talk about that documentary, though. We just so happen that you're here today. But we're talking about something entirely different. I'm excited to tell people about this because I think it's an interesting story. Listen, I'm going to set this up real quick. So animes have huge fans and huge fan bases all over the world. But the one thing that all anime fans seem to agree on is that anyone attempting to make a live action adaptation is just, they're not going to do it. You know, the biggest example of this is Netflix's Cowboy Bebop that was canceled after one season. There's a lot of buzz about this show called One Piece. Rumors that it might actually be the very first actually good adaptation. One Piece is about this teenager is named Monkey D. Luffy who wants to be the king of the pirates. The story is set in this wild, colorful fantasy world, people communicating across distances with snails. There's magical fruit that gives Monkey the power to stretch his body like rubber. That kind of fantasy. Alison, I'm just going to play people the trailer to the show.
Why would anyone want to be a pirate?
This is the best thing there is. Wind in your back, salty sea air, loyal crew by your side. It's ready!
What is it?
Or Jolly Roger. We are the Straw Hat Crew.
One Piece has sold millions of books. The anime is more than 1,000 episodes long and still going. With that kind of fan base, this new show shot to Netflix's top 10 list in the very first week, and the reviews so far, anyway, are much better than usual for a live-action adaptation. Alison, let's get to it. Let's get to the positives. How does One Piece succeed where you think live-action animes have otherwise failed?
Well, first and foremost, they have secured the approval of Eiichiro Oda, the originator of the original manga and anime, which is not the case for many other live-action anime adaptations, including notably Cowboy Bebop, which you just mentioned, which is Netflix's previous foray into this realm. So the producers of this adaptation, Tomorrow Studios, the showrunners, have been very careful to show the fan base that they are working with Oda's vision in mind, that they have consulted with him, that he is on board. And I think that automatically has put the fan base into a more curious and optimistic position rather than what you might call the defensive crouch that I think usually happens when people find out that their beloved staple is going to be taken out of its original context and adjusted in some way.
Okay, we have the approval and then we carry it forward to the show, but part of the appeal of the adaptation is that generally it's an opportunity to welcome a bunch of new fans into the fold, people who don't want to catch up on 1,000 episodes of a long-running show. Do you think the adaptation works for people who have never watched or read any of One Piece?
Yes, I actually think that's probably the foremost advantage of this adaptation, both for Netflix's own ambitions to make this a success as a global platform and also for any neophytes who are stumbling onto One Piece for the first time via this live action adaptation. So frankly, I interacted with One Piece in my younger, more, the days when I was more the target audience for manga and anime, but I didn't really follow with it as an adult, and I didn't have a super clear image in my mind of what I wanted from the adaptation going in. And I thought the show did a great job, frankly, of establishing this world that is so larger than life and eccentric and explaining the rules of how it works, which I think is always very difficult when you're dealing with a fantasy adaptation with so much lore attached to it, and breaking it down into this discrete, there's this one quest. The season follows a very simple and straightforward arc of Monkey D. Luffy has this goal. As he pursues that goal, he acquires allies and enemies, and you slowly start to grasp the contours of this universe and how it works. Yeah. So I think in that sense, it's a really great onboarding, which Netflix is clearly aware of because they've made 15 seasons of the anime available for people to stream in case they get curious and need some more to entertainment to fill their leisure time.
I gotta tell you this, I certainly am curious. I consider myself onboarded. That's what I'm gonna do with my week at some point. Okay, so let's talk about the cast. How do you feel about the cast? Any standout performances from One Piece for you?
I think credit really has to go to the lead actor, Iñaki Godoy, who is only 20 years old, which is both incredible and I think really the right choice for what's ultimately a coming of age story. Yeah. And I think, when you're dealing with something like One Piece that's so beloved and also so under pressure to succeed, there's a lot that goes into a lead performance. You really have to channel the mood and, set the tone for everyone else. And I think he does a great job at capturing that sort of exuberant, happy-go-lucky quality that is a little cartoony, but not in a bad way for an actor, more like it captures the essence that the show as a whole, I think, is trying to channel.
Ooh, that's such a tough needle to thread. But also, I know that you weren't completely sold on the adaptation. What part of it doesn't work for you?
Well, I think it all comes down to that adjective cartoony, right? Or cartoonish. Yeah. I think with live action adaptations, sometimes people get so caught up in the execution and how well it does what it's trying to do that no one really steps back and asks, is this worth attempting in the first place? Not necessarily fiscally or, in terms of Netflix's ambitions or the show's creators wanting to succeed, and more creatively. So I think as someone who is new to One Piece, watching it, or relatively new, I was just very, very conscious that it was all trying to replicate an effect that I think is much more naturally created in an animated format, whether that is, someone turning into rubber in the middle of a battle and inflating themselves up to become a giant balloon, or a shark person walking into a bar wearing a Hawaiian shirt, or a snail phone. And it's cool that they get an approximation, but that sort of mishmash visually, even though we're closer than ever, thanks to modern effects, to being able to just do it practically, it just doesn't quite feel like it is native to live action or was conceived as a live action story. And I think that's a little bit of a tougher hurdle for a viewer like me to get over.
I can imagine. Also, we should say the producers say the scripts for season 2 has been written and episodes could be ready as soon as a year after the actor strike ends. But Netflix has not renewed this yet. What do you think is going on there?
I mean, I think often, frankly, stuff gets renewed and we just don't hear about it right away because networks are very aware that the announcement of a renewal is an opportunity to create engagement and attention, and they don't really want to waste it. But of course, Hollywood in general, I think, is in this very awkward limbo right now. And I think it would only call attention to that limbo if they said, we want to make more, but, look at the headlines and people are all unable to go back to work. So frankly, I would be stunned if there was not a season 2, but I understand why they may not want to jump the gun and say this is definitely happening when so much is up in the air right now.
Alison, I really appreciate you being here. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. Alison Herman is a TV critic at Variety. We reached her in LA. And that is it for the show today. By the way, you remember you can listen to any episode of Commotion anytime you like, live or on demand on the CBC Listen app or wherever you get your podcasts. Also, we are available on YouTube now. That's very exciting for us. My name is Elamin Abdelmahmoud. I'm going to be here tomorrow. So if you're going to be here tomorrow, I'm going to see you then.